All right, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and record this first lesson, Unit 1.1, Foundations of Government. And basically, what this is that if you need to catch up on something, if you need help with something, if you need to go back and listen to how I explained it, will be available to you. So we're going to talk about what began the American era of politics and what began the American era of government. So this is an experiment that's been going on for over 200 years. Why? How has it worked this long? So, first, we have to understand the Enlightenment thinking that kind of ruled the day at the time. And if you guys have taken world history your freshman year, American history your sophomore year, you've heard these names. It's kind of a review. So, that works out really well. First one we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. Dude is super dead, been dead for a long time. What we need to grab from Hobbes is his idea of the social contract. So, if you look down here at the bottom where it is in all caps and underline, that means it's a vocab word. It means it's important. I want you to know that. If we're talking about Thomas Hobbes, we know that we're talking about the social contract. When we're talking about the social contract, we need to know that if you're a citizen of a country or if you agree to be ruled by a government, so like right now, all living in the United States, which means we have agreed to live by the laws presented by the United States. We've entered into this social contract. We agree to be ruled by this United States government. That means they're going to protect us, they're going to provide us with different services, things of that nature. Thomas Hobbes had a very bleak outlook on people in general. He basically thought people were too dumb to rule themselves and too violent to rule themselves. So he's the guy that was like, hey, it would work out really well? A king. Welcome to the British monarchy. So the king has a contract with the people, but he has absolute power, and the people should never remove him from power because they're too dumb to govern themselves. Thomas Hobbes, social contract. Pretty cool. John Locke. Locke was a little bit different than Hobbes in as much as that he didn't think people were stupid or too stupid to rule themselves. Locke believed that people were smart. He believed that people were good at heart, and that if you give them the right circumstances, you could even go as far as to not have a government because people would be so cool to each other that they wouldn't need somebody telling them what to do. Locke believed that your brain is a blank slate and that you are a product of your environment. Now, I have some philosophical disagreements with that. I'll take my sunglasses off because I realize I look silly. I have some philosophical differences with that just because we all know that there are certain circumstances that you're a part of that doesn't necessarily make you a product of your environment, but it does shape kind of how you perceive things. Not that you're going to act like the environment that you're put into. So, John Locke, we're talking about a blank slate. So, whatever you got to do in your notes, highlight, underline, star, make it a different color. The mind's a blank slate. So, without a government, we live in it's a state of non-government. There are no laws. Seems pretty simple. If you're following Hobbes's version of thinking, that means violence and chaos and death. If you're following Locke's version of thinking, if we get to anarchy, that means we've kind of reached the zenith of perfection in government. Government is that institution that exercises power to make and enforce laws affecting the people under its control. And that's great as long as they don't abuse their end of the social contract. You can't ask people to do things that are ridiculously hard or not beneficial to that person. So the government shouldn't ask you or shouldn't force you to pay 75% in taxes. Okay? Because what money are you going to use to pay rent or buy groceries or go to the movies or go to the doctor? The government shouldn't ask you to do that. There are 4 essential forms of government that we're going to talk about. And basically, it's to know, kind of compare and contrast what other government systems look like to ours. So the first one's a monarchy. King or queen is the chief executive, which means they're the head honcho of their respective government. Normally, it's done by family lineage. So if I'm a king, one day my son will be a king, right? Because he's going to take over for me when I die, like the total Lion King Macbeth kind of argument. There are 2 types of monarchy. One's absolute and one's constitutional. An absolute monarchy means the king rules everything, no questions asked. So this is like this is the Lion King situation, right? Mufasa was in charge of everything. Awesome. Then there's the constitutional monarchy. What a constitutional monarchy is that there is a constitution in place that representatives of the people have written down, and they say, King, you have to at least do these things to ensure that people are being taken care of. Like, you can't just make up all the rules. So there's a check and a balance there where elected representatives can say, hey, you're being too mean to people. You're taxing them too much. You can't force them to do certain things. You're being like terrible. That's a monarchy. And you need to know the difference between absolute and constitutional. Democracy. General population votes on leadership. There are normally two types, direct and representative. Direct democracy, think like ancient Rome way back when, where there weren't that very many people voting on things. That's a direct democracy because every single person was required to go and vote. So if there was an issue, they had to go and vote about it. A representative democracy, similar to what we live in the United States, is where we elect people to represent us. I'm not going to Washington, D.C. every week to have my opinions known on issues. Instead, I have elected somebody to do that for me. The third and fourth forms of government, there's my hand, third and fourth. The third one is an oligarchy, which means there's a small group of people. Normally this is religious or this is military based. And if you look, a lot of times in countries that have seen revolutions in the last 15 or 20 years, think Egypt, Iran's kind of an older example, places like that where the government has taken something over and they don't have a king or a dictator or a president. They have a small group of people that are making all these decisions on their own. And normally, because it's religious or military based, normally means it was taken over by a coup. Most places don't have a group ruling solely without there being some kind of internal conflict beforehand. And then a dictatorship, one supreme leader rules the whole thing. He rules through force or threat of force, and he often takes power by force. Prime example would be, say, Castro in Cuba 50 years ago. He took over the government with the help of an army. He was the only one in power. He took it by force, and the reason why people dealt with it for so long is because he used force to force compliance. So if you were in Cuba in 1975 and you said something bad about Castro, you were gone. You disappeared. Poof. One prime non-example of taking something by force would be Adolf Hitler in Germany in the 30s. He was elected to a position, and people agreed to let him become the dictator. They said, yeah, you're really smart. We should let you do this. And then history plays itself out. So that is a dictatorship. So these are the 5 things that government should provide. Leadership, because if we're following it, if you look at the American republic that we live in today, we are striking an even balance between Hobbes and Locke. We think we're good. We think we're smart enough to do things on our own, but we've also proven that we can't handle these kind of responsibilities on our own, and we need somebody to kind of guide us. So some of these are in order to just help us, and some of these are because we can't handle government on our own as individuals in this nation. So the first thing is provide leadership. Because people may not be smart enough down to the single person level to govern themselves and make sure they're making the best decisions for themselves, we need somebody in place to provide leadership and to lead us, to help us not kill ourselves, basically. Maintain order. We're controlling conflict between people, between groups of people, between the police and civilians, between the army and civilians, those kind of things. The government's in place to maintain order. Provide public services, create schools, build sewers, pave roads, promote public health. You can't really control a country full of uneducated or unhealthy people because they're going to eventually not want to be in that situation anymore. And then you won't have anything to control because you'll be overthrown. Providing national security, making sure that we're being protected from threats, both domestic and foreign. So making sure we're not getting bombed by our own citizens or by other countries. and providing economic security and assistance. If you lose your job, you can apply for unemployment. That's through the government. The government's going to make sure that you don't default on all of your loans so that you're not homeless, because a lot of homeless people are a bad thing, because that means people can't make enough money to live. That's a problem. So the government can provide a small amount of economic security and assistance. We're not giving people just paychecks for existing. And there are some countries out there that provide a kind of a quote unquote minimum living stipend each month to their citizens. We don't do that because that would cause us to raise our taxes. People don't like taxes, so we don't do that. But if you find yourselves on hard times, you're in between jobs, you get let go, you get cut from your job, whatever the case may be, you can file for these kind of things to help you make it so that you don't lose everything in the process. Here's some important vocabulary I want you to know. A nation is a sizable group of people who believe themselves united by common bonds of race, language, custom, or religion. One of the weirdest examples that we have in 2019, and not so much anymore because they're starting to disappear, is ISIS. And if you've been paying attention at all in the news to ISIS right now, they're kind of disbanding, but 5 years ago, they believed themselves to be their own nation. It was a sizable group of people. They had taken by force a size of land the size of Great Britain in the Middle East. And they were united by race, language, custom, and religion. So by definition, ISIS could have been considered their own country. However, the international community did not see them as a country because of how they took power and how they did everything. They did it all through fear and threat of force and killing people who didn't agree with them. So the international community said, no, we will never recognize you as a country or a nation because you did these things. So then you have nation, which is just a group of people. And then you have state, which is a political community that occupies a definite territory and has an organized government. So one is just a group of people who believe in themselves, and the other is an actual organized and established government system. You'll hear the terms country, which is kind of interchangeable with the two, and you'll hear the term nation state, which is the group of people who believe themselves with a government. If you tie all these things together, we're talking about a country. That's the textbook definition of what we work with here in this class. This will probably be our last slide on this video. So we're talking about sovereignty. And if you look in the middle of that word, you'll see the word reign. Reign normally means to control something, right? So sovereignty means that that country or that nation or that state controls itself. If you are sovereign, that means you don't have to answer to anyone else. When you turn 18 and you move out of mom and dad's house, you are sovereign. Okay, you don't have to listen to anybody, right? You can do whatever you want. If you want to stay up till 3 o'clock eating Cheetos, you can do that. You're sovereign. You don't have anybody yelling at you going, go to bed. You don't have that. So a state in the United States, so think about like Ohio, Florida, Texas, New York, a state is not sovereign because it answers to the higher federal government. Like right now, Governor DeWine has to answer to President Trump. That's how it works. But the United States federal government is sovereign, which means that the United States federal government is only answerable to itself. So there is no higher authority telling the United States federal government what it should be doing. Now, popular sovereignty, which is what we like to think the United States is ruled by, refers to how a government answers to its people instead of a higher power. So in theory, if we as U.S. citizens are unhappy with what President Trump is doing, we can lodge a bunch of complaints and we can encourage our representatives to reprimand him or what have you. But the people are driving the ship. It's not just the government. The people can actually have an effect on what happens in government. And eventually, like if Donald Trump wants to be reelected, he has to keep enough people happy to reelect him. So he is answering to the people. He's not guaranteed a second term. The people tell him if he has a second term. That's popular sovereignty. Population, the population of the country is in control. All right. Hopefully, that's a lot of information. Hopefully you guys are good with it. Really appreciate your guys' time. Hopefully this was helpful. I will talk to you guys later.